August 6, 1945. The clear blue sky over Hiroshima betrayed no hint of the horror about to unfold. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the bustling city, 29-year-old Tsutomu Yamaguchi stirred in his modest lodgings. For 3 long months, he had been away from his beloved wife and infant son, toiling as an engineer for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. His work designing oil tankers had been grueling, but today promised a sweet reward. It was to be his final day in Hiroshima before returning home to Nagasaki. Yamaguchi rose early, his mind already racing with thoughts of the journey ahead. He carefully folded his futon, savoring the familiar routine one last time. As he prepared a simple breakfast of rice and miso soup, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. The war had taken its toll on Japan, but here in Hiroshima, life continued with a semblance of normalcy. Little did he know that in mere hours, the very concept of normal would be forever shattered. The morning air was already thick with humidity as Yamaguchi stepped out onto the street. The cacophony of daily life enveloped him. The chatter of neighbors, the distant rumble of streetcars, the laughter of children making their way to school. He breathed it all in, committing these ordinary moments to memory. They would soon become precious relics of a world about to vanish. As he made his way towards the shipyard, Yamaguchi's thoughts drifted to his family. He imagined his wife, Hisako, perhaps at that very moment, tending to their young son, Katsutoshi. The image brought a smile to his face and a spring to his step. Just one more day of work, and he would be on the train back to them. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the ordinary rhythm of the morning was shattered. A lone American B-29 bomber, later identified as the Enola Gay, appeared high in the cloudless sky. In that instant, before anyone could comprehend what was happening, the world erupted in a blaze of unimaginable light. The atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated with a force equivalent to 15,000 tons of TNT. The flash was brighter than 1,000 suns, turning the morning into a hellish noon. Yamaguchi, who had been walking across a bridge, had just enough time to register the aircraft before the sky itself seemed to split open. The blast knocked him off his feet, sending him tumbling across the bridge. In those fractions of a second, as the shockwave tore through the air, Yamaguchi's world went silent. The deafening roar of the explosion was beyond the capacity of human ears to process. As he hit the ground, a searing pain enveloped him. The heat of the blast, reaching temperatures hotter than the surface of the sun, scorched his left side. For what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few moments, Yamaguchi lay stunned on the ground. When he finally managed to open his eyes, he found himself in a landscape transformed beyond recognition. The familiar streets and buildings of Hiroshima had vanished, replaced by a nightmarish tableau of destruction. As his senses slowly returned, the full horror of the situation began to dawn on him. The air was thick with dust and smoke, making it difficult to breathe. The acrid smell of burning flesh and scorched earth filled his nostrils. And then, cutting through the eerie silence that followed the blast, came the sounds that would haunt Yamaguchi for the rest of his life. The agonized cries of the injured and dying. Dazed and disoriented, Yamaguchi struggled to his feet. His left side throbbed with pain, and he realized with a jolt that his left eardrum had ruptured. The world around him swam in and out of focus as he tried to make sense of what had happened. Buildings that had stood proudly just moments ago were now piles of twisted metal and shattered concrete. Fires raged unchecked, consuming everything in their path. Through the haze of shock and pain, one thought crystallized in Yamaguchi's mind. He had to find shelter. Operating on pure instinct, he began to stumble through the ruins of the city. The streets he had walked just that morning were now unrecognizable, strewn with debris and bodies. Survivors, their clothes tattered and skin hanging in strips, wandered aimlessly, their eyes vacant with shock. As he made his way through the devastation, Yamaguchi encountered scenes that defied comprehension. People whose bodies had been so badly burned that their gender was indistinguishable. Children crying out for parents who would never answer. The lucky ones had died instantly, the unlucky faced a slow, agonizing death. After what felt like hours, but was likely only a short time, Yamaguchi found himself at the partially destroyed Mitsubishi shipyard. There, in a bomb shelter, he encountered two of his colleagues who had also survived the initial blast. Together, they huddled in the darkness, trying to comprehend the incomprehensible. As the day wore on, the full scale of the disaster began to emerge. Rumors spread among the survivors. This was no ordinary bomb. Some spoke of a new weapon, something beyond imagination. In the bomb shelter, Yamaguchi and his colleagues debated what to do next. The city was in chaos. Communications were down, and no one knew if more attacks were coming. Despite his injuries, Yamaguchi's thoughts turned to his family in Nagasaki. He had to get back to them, to make sure they were safe. As night fell, he made a decision that would alter the course of his life. He would attempt to return to Nagasaki. The journey to the train station was a descent into hell. The fires that had been raging all day had merged into a massive firestorm, consuming huge swaths of the city. The heat was so intense that Yamaguchi felt as if his skin might melt off his bones. The smoke was thick and choking, making every breath a struggle. Incredibly, some trains were still running. Yamaguchi, along with other shell-shock survivors, boarded a train bound for Nagasaki. As they pulled away from the ruined city, Yamaguchi caught a final glimpse of Hiroshima. The once vibrant city was now a smoldering wasteland, unrecognizable save for a few landmark buildings that had miraculously remained standing. The overnight journey was a blur of pain and fevered dreams. Yamaguchi drifted in and out of consciousness, his body racked with pain from his burns and the radiation exposure he didn't yet understand. When he wasn't consumed by physical agony, his mind tortured him with images of what he had witnessed. The faces of the dead and dying haunted his fitful attempts at sleep. As dawn broke on August 8th, the train pulled into Nagasaki Station. Yamaguchi, barely able to stand, stumbled onto the platform. The normality of the scene, people going about their daily business, the city untouched by war, felt surreal after the apocalyptic landscape he had left behind in Hiroshima. Summoning the last of his strength, Yamaguchi made his way home. The reunion with his wife and son was bittersweet. While overjoyed to see them safe, Yamaguchi was a changed man. As he recounted the horrors he had witnessed, he saw the disbelief in his wife's eyes. How could he make her understand something he himself could barely comprehend? Despite his injuries and the trauma he had endured, Yamaguchi felt compelled to report to work the next day. Perhaps it was a desperate attempt to cling to normalcy, or maybe it was the ingrained sense of duty that had been instilled in him. Whatever the reason, on the morning of August 9th, Yamaguchi found himself in his office at Mitsubishi's Nagasaki shipyard. As he described to his supervisor the destruction he had witnessed in Hiroshima, Yamaguchi was met with skepticism. How could a single bomb destroy an entire city? It seemed impossible beyond belief. Little did they know that in mere moments, they would witness the impossible firsthand. At 11:02 a.m., just as Yamaguchi was in the middle of recounting his experiences, a familiar blinding flash lit up the sky over Nagasaki. In that moment, Yamaguchi's world stopped. It couldn't be happening again. It was impossible. And yet, as the seconds stretched into eternity, he knew with horrifying certainty that it was. The blast knocked Yamaguchi to the ground for the second time in 3 days. As the shockwave tore through the building, he was certain that this time he would not survive. The universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of irony. To have escaped death in Hiroshima only to face it again in Nagasaki seemed like a cosmic joke of unfathomable proportions. When the dust settled and Yamaguchi realized he was still alive, his first thought was for his family. In a daze, he stumbled out of the ruined office building and into a scene of devastation eerily similar to what he had witnessed in Hiroshima. Once again, the air was filled with the cries of the injured and the acrid smell of burning flesh. Yamaguchi's journey home through the ruins of Nagasaki was a nightmare déjà vu. Every step was agony, both physical and emotional. The thought that kept him going was the hope that his wife and son had somehow survived. As he neared his home, he saw that the house had been badly damaged by the blast. For a moment, his heart stopped. Then, miraculously, he heard a cry. It was his son, Katsutoshi. Yamaguchi rushed inside to find his wife, injured but alive, cradling their child. In that moment, amid the chaos and destruction, Yamaguchi felt a surge of something he had thought lost forever: hope. The days that followed were a blur of survival. Yamaguchi and his family, like thousands of others, struggled to find food and clean water. The risk of fire was constant, and the air was thick with radioactive fallout, though they didn't yet understand the long-term dangers this posed. As news of Japan's surrender reached them on August 15th, Yamaguchi and his family faced an uncertain future. Their city was in ruins, their country defeated, and they were suffering from injuries both visible and invisible. The war was over. But for Yamaguchi and other survivors, a different kind of battle was just beginning. The first part of the script remains the same up to the paragraph mentioned above. Then it continues as follows. In the weeks and months that followed, Yamaguchi and his family struggled with the effects of radiation sickness. Their hair fell out in clumps. They were plagued by nausea and fatigue, and their burns healed slowly, leaving painful scars. But perhaps the deepest wounds were psychological. Yamaguchi was haunted by nightmares, reliving the horrors he had witnessed in both cities. The Yamaguchi family's experience was not unique. Across Hiroshima and Nagasaki, survivors grappled with similar ailments, their bodies and minds forever altered by their exposure to radiation. The Japanese word hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people, became a term laden with both sympathy and stigma. For Yamaguchi, the physical recovery was arduous. The burns on his left side, caused by the Hiroshima blast, were slow to heal. He underwent multiple skin grafts, each procedure a painful reminder of that fateful day. His hearing, damaged by the dual explosions, never fully recovered. These physical ailments were a constant, tangible connection to his experiences, making it impossible to simply move on, as some well-meaning friends and colleagues suggested. The psychological toll was equally heavy. Yamaguchi found himself startling at loud noises, his mind instantly transported back to the moments of detonation. He struggled with survivor's guilt, constantly questioning why he had been spared when so many others perished. The faces of those he had seen in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, burned, disfigured, pleading for help, haunted his dreams and waking hours alike. As Japan began the long process of rebuilding, Yamaguchi tried to piece his life back together. He returned to work at Mitsubishi, throwing himself into the task of reconstruction. The company, like much of Japan's industry, had been devastated by the war. Yamaguchi's engineering skills were in high demand as the nation sought to rebuild its infrastructure and economy. However, Yamaguchi was a changed man. The experience of surviving not one, but two atomic bombings had given him a unique perspective on the horrors of nuclear warfare. He found it difficult to reconcile the mundane concerns of daily life with the apocalyptic scenes he had witnessed. How could he focus on designing ships when he had seen entire cities reduced to ash in an instant? In the immediate post-war years, Yamaguchi, like many hibakusha, remained silent about his experiences. There were several reasons for this silence. Firstly, there was a deep-seated cultural reluctance in Japan to speak about personal suffering. The concept of gamen, enduring hardship without complaint, was deeply ingrained in the national psyche. Secondly, there was a very real fear of discrimination. In a society grappling with widespread poverty and hardship, many viewed the hibakusha with a mixture of pity and suspicion. There were unfounded fears about radiation sickness being contagious, and concerns about the long-term health effects of radiation exposure led to discrimination in employment and marriage prospects. For Yamaguchi, there was an additional layer of complexity. As a survivor of both bombings, his story seemed so incredible that he feared being accused of exaggeration or attention-seeking. He also grappled with a sense of guilt. Why had he survived when so many others had perished? Did his survival of the Hiroshima bombing, only to be present for the Nagasaki bombing, somehow make him complicit? Despite these internal struggles, Yamaguchi pressed on with his life. In 1957, he and his wife welcomed a daughter, Toshiko. The birth of his daughter was a turning point for Yamaguchi, holding his newborn child. He was struck by the stark contrast between the world of his children and the world he had known during the war. The joy of new life stood in sharp relief against the mass death he had witnessed. It was around this time that Yamaguchi began to feel a growing sense of responsibility. As he watched Toshiko grow, he became increasingly concerned about the world she would inherit. The Cold War was in full swing, and the threat of nuclear annihilation loomed large. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, a prospect that filled Yamaguchi with dread. He began to question his silence. Was he not obligated, as someone who had witnessed the horrors of atomic warfare firsthand, to speak out? Did he not have a duty to work towards a world where his children and grandchildren would never have to experience what he had? Yamaguchi's journey from survivor to activist was a gradual one. It began with small steps, sharing his story with his children, then with close friends. He found that speaking about his experiences, though painful, was also cathartic. It allowed him to process his trauma and gave meaning to his survival. As the years passed, Yamaguchi became more vocal. He began by sharing his story with local schools and community groups. His talks were not just recountings of the bombings, but impassioned pleas for peace and nuclear disarmament. He described in vivid detail the destruction he had witnessed and the long-term effects of radiation exposure, putting a human face on the often abstract discussions of nuclear policy. Yamaguchi's unique status as a survivor of both bombings gave his words special weight. He could speak not just of the immediate devastation, but of the eerie similarities and differences between the two attacks. He could describe how the knowledge of what was happening, gained in Hiroshima, had done nothing to lessen the terror and chaos in Nagasaki. As Yamaguchi became more comfortable sharing his story, he also began to delve deeper into the technical and political aspects of nuclear weapons. He educated himself on nuclear physics, international relations, and the history of the Manhattan Project. This knowledge allowed him to engage in more nuanced discussions about nuclear policy and disarmament efforts. In the 1980s and 90s, as the Cold War began to thaw, Yamaguchi found new opportunities to share his message. He began writing, publishing several books about his experiences and his views on nuclear disarmament. His writings were notable for their lack of bitterness or anger towards the United States. Instead, they focus on the universal human cost of war and the urgent need for peace. Yamaguchi's activism took on a new dimension in the late 1990s and early 2000s. As the last generation of World War II veterans and atomic bomb survivors began to age, there was a growing awareness of the importance of preserving their stories. Yamaguchi became involved in efforts to record and archive Hibakusha testimonies, ensuring that future generations would have access to first-hand accounts of the atomic bombings. In 2005, at the age of 88, Yamaguchi took his message to an international stage. He traveled to New York to attend a showing of Nijuhibaku, Twice Bombed, a documentary about survivors of both atomic bombings. The film brought renewed attention to Yamaguchi's unique story, and he seized the opportunity to advocate for nuclear disarmament on a global scale. The experience of traveling to the United States was profound for Yamaguchi. Standing in New York City, a place he had once viewed as an enemy capital, he was struck by the common humanity he shared with the Americans he met. Many were moved to tears by his story, and Yamaguchi found himself forging connections he never thought possible. This trip marked the beginning of a new phase in Yamaguchi's activism. He began to see his role not just as a witness to history, but as a bridge between cultures. He spoke of the importance of international cooperation in the face of global threats, emphasizing that the destructive power of nuclear weapons knew no national boundaries. Yamaguchi's most significant moment as an activist came in 2006, when he addressed the United Nations. Standing before world leaders, this humble engineer who had witnessed firsthand the dawn of the atomic age delivered a powerful plea for peace. The gravity of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Here was a man who had experienced the worst that humanity could inflict, yet still found the strength to advocate for a better future. His speech that day was both a recounting of the horrors he had witnessed and a call to action. He spoke of the flash brighter than the sun, the heat that melted stone, the blast that leveled cities. But he also spoke of resilience, of the human capacity for forgiveness, and the urgent need for reconciliation. "I can't understand why the world cannot understand the agony of the nuclear bombs," he said. "How can they keep developing these weapons?" Yamaguchi's words that day resonated far beyond the walls of the UN. His testimony was a stark reminder of the human cost of nuclear warfare, cutting through the often abstract and sanitized discussions of nuclear strategy. He forced world leaders to confront the real consequences of their policies, to see the faces behind the casualty statistics. In the years following his UN speech, Yamaguchi's profile as an activist continued to grow. He gave numerous interviews, appeared in documentaries, and continued to speak at schools and universities. His message remained consistent. A world free of nuclear weapons was not just desirable, but necessary for the survival of humanity. Yamaguchi's advocacy work took on a new urgency in the late 2000s as tensions between nuclear-armed nations rose and the threat of proliferation loomed large. He saw disturbing parallels between the rhetoric of his time and the nationalism that had led to World War II. In response, he redoubled his efforts, determined to make his voice heard while he still could. In 2009, at the age of 93, Yamaguchi received official recognition from the Japanese government as a Niju Hibakusha, a survivor of both atomic bombings. This acknowledgement, while welcome, was bittersweet. Yamaguchi had never sought personal recognition. His goal had always been to honor the memory of those who had not survived and to prevent such tragedies from ever happening again. The recognition did, however, provide Yamaguchi with an even larger platform for his message. In the months that followed, he used his newfound prominence to continue his advocacy work, giving interviews and writing articles that reached a global audience. As his health began to fail, Yamaguchi's thoughts turned to the legacy he would leave behind. He worried about the state of the world and the continuing threat of nuclear weapons, but he also found hope in the younger generations, particularly in the growing global movement for nuclear disarmament. In his final interviews and writings, Yamaguchi reflected on the long journey that had brought him from the ruins of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to the world stage. He spoke of the transformative power of forgiveness, both for individuals and nations. He emphasized the importance of education in preventing future conflicts, arguing that an understanding of history and an appreciation for diverse cultures were key to lasting peace. Yamaguchi also addressed the Hibakusha community, particularly the younger survivors and the children of survivors. He encouraged them to continue sharing their stories, to ensure that the lessons of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were never forgotten. He spoke of the responsibility that came with their unique perspective, urging them to use their voices in the service of peace. In his last days, Yamaguchi expressed a mix of concern and hope for the future. He worried about the continuing existence of nuclear weapons and the rise of nationalism in various parts of the world. But he also saw signs of progress, growing public awareness of the nuclear threat, increasing cooperation between nations on global issues, and a new generation committed to peace and disarmament. Tsutomu Yamaguchi passed away on January 4, 2010, at the age of 93. His death marked the end of a remarkable life, one that spanned the most tumultuous period in human history. From the ashes of 2 atomic bombings, he had emerged as a powerful voice for peace, a living testament to both the horrors of nuclear warfare and the indomitable nature of the human spirit. News of Yamaguchi's passing was met with an outpouring of tributes from around the world. World leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens alike recognized the significance of his life and work. Many pointed to Yamaguchi as an example of resilience in the face of unimaginable adversity and the power of individual action to effect change. In Japan, Yamaguchi's death was particularly poignant. As one of the last surviving Niju Hibakusha, his passing represented the fading of living memory of the atomic bombings. It underscored the urgency of preserving and sharing the stories of the Hibakusha, ensuring that future generations would understand the true cost of nuclear warfare. Yamaguchi's legacy lives on in many ways. His books continue to be read and studied, providing first-hand accounts of one of the most significant events in human history. The documentaries featuring his testimony serve as powerful educational tools, bringing the reality of atomic warfare to new audiences. Perhaps most importantly, Yamaguchi's life work continues through the efforts of those he inspired. Anti-nuclear activists around the world draw strength and motivation from his example. His story is taught in schools, not just as a historical account, but as a lesson in the importance of peace, forgiveness, and the power of one individual to make a difference. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Yamaguchi is remembered as a symbol of survival and resilience. His unique experience as a survivor of both bombings makes him a powerful reminder of the shared history of these two cities. Annual peace ceremonies in both cities often include references to Yamaguchi's story and his lifelong commitment to nuclear disarmament. On the international stage, Yamaguchi's influence continues to be felt in discussions of nuclear policy. His testimony at the United Nations and in other international forums serves as a constant reminder of the human cost of nuclear weapons. Diplomats and policymakers working on disarmament issues often cite Yamaguchi's words as a moral imperative for their work. Yamaguchi's story has also inspired artists and writers around the world. Novels, plays, and films have been created based on his experiences, helping to bring his message to new audiences. These artistic interpretations serve not just as memorials to Yamaguchi, but as new ways of engaging with the complex moral and existential questions raised by the atomic bombings. In the years since Yamaguchi's passing, the relevance of his message has only grown. As nuclear tensions have risen in various parts of the world, his warnings about the catastrophic consequences of nuclear warfare have taken on new urgency. His call for disarmament and international cooperation resonates in a world grappling with global challenges that transcend national borders. At the same time, Yamaguchi's story continues to offer hope. It stands as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of forgiveness, and the ability of individuals to shape history. In a world often overwhelmed by the scale of its problems, Yamaguchi's life reminds us that one person's voice, raised in the cause of peace, can make a difference. As we reflect on Tsutomu Yamaguchi's extraordinary life, we're left with both a sense of awe at his resilience and a weighty responsibility. His story is not just a historical curiosity, but a call to action. It challenges us to work tirelessly for a world free from the threat of nuclear destruction, to ensure that the horrors he witnessed are never repeated. Yamaguchi's double nuclear nightmare is a testament to human resilience, but also a stark warning. It reminds us of the awesome and terrible power we wield, and the responsibility we bear to use our technological prowess wisely and ethically. It calls us to recommit ourselves to the cause of peace, to work towards a future where such weapons exist only in history books. As we face the challenges of our own time, climate change, terrorism, economic inequality, Yamaguchi's story reminds us of our shared humanity and the fragility of our existence. It teaches us that even in the darkest of times, there is hope, and that one person's voice, raised in the cause of peace, can make a difference. In the end, perhaps the greatest tribute we can pay to Tsutomu Yamaguchi and all victims of atomic warfare is to heed his call for a nuclear-free world, to work tirelessly, in ways both large and small, towards a future where the power of the atom is harnessed not for destruction, but for the betterment of humanity. A world where the flash of nuclear fire exists only in memory, and where the indomitable human spirit that Yamaguchi embodied can flourish in peace. As we close this chapter, we invite you to reflect on Yamaguchi's story, to share it with others, and to consider what role you can play in building a more peaceful world. For in the end, the truest memorial to Tsutomu Yamaguchi is not just remembrance, but action. Action to ensure that his unimaginable experience remains unique in human history, that no one ever again has to endure what he endured. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most extraordinary lives of the 20th century. May Tsutomu Yamaguchi's story continue to inspire and challenge us, reminding us always of the preciousness of peace and the enduring power of the human spirit. Yendi,